Thank you very much indeed, Declan. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and it's a great honour for me as well to be invited again to speak to the Irish Science Teachers Association. I first spoke here to the association 6 years ago in response, as Declan has said, to the then decision of the NCCA to change the template that was being used for curriculum design. And while I'm not a scientist, I've done a lot of work on curriculum and curriculum design, both nationally and internationally, and I'll just touch upon that later on. So just to start off very briefly, because we're just half an hour and there are a few of us that are speaking, so my talk will not go longer than a half an hour, I promise. Just to remind ourselves, Ireland has a good take-up of science in second level. 80% of our students take science in junior cycle, 62% take biology for leaving cert, 17% take chemistry for leaving cert, 14% take physics for leaving cert, 14% take agricultural science, and 28% of all third level students major in STEM subjects. By international standards, that's quite high. So we have, relatively speaking, a healthy situation in relation to STEM education, which we really do want to keep. And of course, we have some superb teachers, there's no doubt about that. The secondary school curriculum, again, you all are aware, it's a national curriculum. It's decided by the Minister of Education. We have junior cert and leaving cert. We have 2 examinations. At the moment, both of them are national, externally assessed examinations. And that is the wish of the teaching profession and has been in Ireland for many, many years. We have an externally assessed system since 1872, more than 150 years now. So it's quite clear that while other countries may have handled the situation differently in relation to assessment, the wish of the Irish teachers is that it continue to be, the leaving cert continue to be externally assessed. The Minister is advised by the NCCA, the National Council for Curriculum Assessment. The examinations are set and marked by the State Examinations Commission. So we have 2 bodies, one with responsibility for, it's a statutory body for advising on curriculum and assessment, and the second is the body that carries out the marking and setting of papers. Now, to me, this may be one of our dilemmas here at the moment, a lack of clarity as to who is responsible for what, particularly when it comes, let's say, to the detail that we are now looking for. The junior cycle science syllabus was, and I'm using the word syllabus looking backwards, and I suppose I will use the word specification looking forward, although to be honest, syllabus is a word that's been used for over 100 years. I'm not quite sure why internationally people are now beginning to use the word specification. However, that's the way it is. We are all, certainly most of us here are familiar with the concept of a syllabus, a subject syllabus. When the NCCA decided to revise the syllabi, and it became clear that the revised syllabi would consist only of learning outcomes, as Declan has mentioned, in the year 2013, ISTA wrote to the NCCA expressing its concern and asking the depth of treatment and range of subject knowledge be integrated into the draft syllabi. And the reply of the NCCA, which Declan has touched on, the NCCA said we don't intend to include depth of treatment and our range of subject knowledge in the new specifications. Now, this is, of course, why I was then asked to do some research. It was suggested that that was in accordance with international best practice, and it was to look at international practice in other countries, particularly in English-speaking countries, that I was asked to do some research on the matter. And for the last 6 years, I have very much kept in touch with what is happening in other countries. The junior cycle syllabus was issued, in spite of the concerns of the ISTA, containing only learning outcomes, and we know the phrases that have been used in the training of teachers, or their introduction to the new syllabus or specification, was that they should unpack the learning outcomes for themselves. The first subjects to be examined in summer 2019 were science, business studies, and English. Last summer, before the exam results were out, in fact just before the exam, the ISTA sent out a questionnaire to ask their members what there are a whole range of questions, but the one I'm focusing in on today was the question about the design. In other words, there was a new design for the junior cycle specification. How would you feel if the same design were to be used for Leaving Certificate? How would you feel if the specifications at Leaving Certificate level used the same template? And as you can see there, a very, very significant number of teachers felt they did not want that. In fact, 85% said it would either be unacceptable or they would be dissatisfied if such an approach were taken. And their comments are pretty strong. And again, this report is available. It's on the ISTA website. And I think it's quite important because there were over 760 teachers who responded. It's a huge response rate. Those of us who have carried out empirical research, quantitative research, we very rarely get such a very high response rate. And it indicates something. It indicates the teachers wishing to have their voice heard. And when teachers speak so clearly, and so many of them speaking, if you like, in the same voice, then I think it's certainly incumbent, and in my long experience, government and the Department of Education and ministers listen to them. And I mean, today, that's exactly what's going to be happening. The more people that say something, their voices should be listened to. And as you can see here, some of the comments, and I didn't, we didn't pick them especially just because they were negative, but almost all of them were in this vein. The learning outcomes do not give enough information about depth of treatment and are open to interpretation by teachers and the State Examinations Commission. And I could go on. They're far too vague for such a high stakes examination. This is very important, and I'll have a look at this shortly. Vague learning outcomes will lead to dumbing down. It needs to be clear what has to be taught. The specification is far too vague. And the courses that are highly regarded by international standards, for example, the IB, and we'll have some speakers talking about the IB shortly, have much more specific syllabi so that the students are very clear about what they need to know. You've probably noticed that over the last year, since business studies, English and science were examined, and this year the training of teachers for 3 or 4, by the end of this year, all of the teachers will have introduced the new junior cycle specifications, and many of them are very uneasy about it. Rita O'Brien, who's a teacher in Muckross, she wrote in the Irish Times on the 18th of January that teachers have been very unhappy with the new junior certificate syllabus. In fact, she was calling for teachers. She has a column every Saturday, as many of you know, and she was calling on them to use the election campaigns to draw their concern to the attention of the candidates and of the Minister for Education. And she used a very interesting phrase that the students and that the teachers and their students feel as if they are floundering around in a fog. She quoted, "There was a correspondent, and I have unapologetically entered into the correspondence in the national media, secret teacher article. I have no idea who he or she was, but they compared the NCCA's approach. I thought it was great, and it actually catches the spirit of those who are not familiar with templates. I mean, if you use words like templates and specifications, syllabi in a letter to the newspapers, won't get published. But the secret teacher said, it's like an IKEA flat pack, but with no instructions. Everybody understands that. You get thousands of pieces and you can't make head or tail of them. But now we have come to the point where the subject development groups have been set up for individual syllabi for our specification for the Leaving Certificate. They're now being drafted, and they will be the examination syllabi for the Leaving Certificate. The Leaving Certificate, as we all know, is held in high esteem by students, teachers, parents, higher education institutions and employers, not just in Ireland, but across the world. The Leaving Certificate, as we also know, it has a dual purpose. certifies successful completion of second level education, and it is the passport for admission to higher education. I use that word passport advisedly. Now, that wasn't always the case. Even in my own youth, I'm much older than all of you here. I'm 15 years almost retired now, so I'm not at all a young person. But when I was in secondary school, the matriculation, there was both, every university had its own matriculation examination, and it was your entrance to the university, the very tiny number. When I did my Leaving Cert in 1959, only 4% of the population went on to university, and they all had to sit the matriculation, and they all had to pass the matriculation. So while the Leaving Cert was there in the background for maybe the other, there weren't, only about 20% took the Leaving Cert of the age group. And it was, if you like, certifying the completion of Leaving Cert. But it was agreed and decided by the third level institutions during the 60s, 70s and 80s that to streamline the system, they would accept the Leaving Cert as the matriculation examination for entrance into third level. And it's now accepted by all third level institutions in Ireland and by many in other countries as well. Now, the Leaving Certificate examination in Ireland, it's externally set and assessed, and I can't emphasise this sufficiently, because in some of the good practice examples that the NCCA have published, they have used both internally assessed examinations and externally assessed. Now, we can only benchmark ourselves against externally set and assessed examinations, and I think that is correct, because in my many, many years, I have seen the problems. There are problems about school-based assessment. And I'm fortunate in one way. I have 6 grandsons. Two eldest are now in university. They're American citizens. They're in a country that doesn't have an externally set and assessed examination. And so each school assesses its own pupils. But of course, the universities don't really accept that. The students then have to sit a separate SAT and ACT and other examinations in a way which really would be more like the matriculation. So I think the strength of our Leaving Certificate, while it is being asked to do a lot of things, it's being asked to assess all our students who are in 6th year, whether almost all of ours take the established Leaving Cert or the LCBP, which of course is the same thing really with an additional subject. But that means that almost 90% of our students sit the Leaving Certificate. So it is challenging to set an examination that assesses the performance of students right across the ability range. But it is there, and it is a high-stakes national examination. It's accepted, as I say, by all higher education institutions for admission, and it's also accepted by many leading universities internationally. There was talk, and many of you were involved in the pilots and the experiments, if you like, to see if we could, as a country, introduce practicals into the Leaving Cert science subjects, biology, physics and chemistry. And there have been a number of different pilots, if you like. Many of you were involved 10 years ago. And then again, more recently, the State Examinations Commission with the NCCA had some pilots. And as a result of those, while the report, they're all online, you can read the reports of those pilot and Leaving Cert science practicals. But when they came to the minister, December 2018, the then minister was Joe McHugh, he decided that because of logistical and financial challenges, they would abandon the plan to have that type of practical, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And he asked the NCCA to explore the option of a coursework assessment, such as a project, which would allow for assessment of inquiry-based learning, critical thinking, and some experimental investigation. And I'm sure those of you who are on the development groups are more familiar with the detail of that than I am. But in other words, we have unambiguously made a decision, Minister, and there's no reason to expect that will change, that the Leaving Certificate will continue to be externally assessed. I have no difficulty, and I don't think any of you have any difficulty with the actual broad framework within which the new senior cycle science subjects will be set. But this is where we have a problem. Curriculum content will be expressed as learning outcomes, in which inquiry-based learning are the key skills of senior cycle, critical and creative thinking, being personally effective, working with others, communication and information processing were embedded, driven by a need to change the focus of assessment and to include practical assessment. But again, as we know now, there is not going to be practical assessment. I just touch back on my own report. Even though it was written 66 years ago, it was written with a view to the design of the new and reformed Leaving Certificate. And my conclusion at that time, which has not changed, was that when the revised Leaving Certificate syllabi have been approved, the full range of syllabus documentation, including teachers' notes, examination specifications, etc., should be officially published at the same time as the syllabus itself under the logo of the Department of Education and Skills, as has been the case in the past. And I made the point, and I've made here, it's not sufficient to describe a high-stakes examination syllabus in terms merely of topics and learning outcomes. More detailed information about the depth of treatment of subjects and the requirements for examination must be provided at national level in Ireland to bring the syllabi into line with international good practice. Now, just because I know, Ireland is a small country and you know what people are saying, and I know that people are saying, well, Aine Hyland is old, she's been there a long time. I am old, I'm in my late 70s, but I am passionately interested. I was delighted Sean Finn described me yesterday. We were talking about the storm here coming today. He said, and Hurricane Hyland is coming as well. So I was it's the best compliment I've got in my old age yet. And I repeat again here, an externally assessed high-stakes examination syllabus should not be defined solely in terms of learning outcomes. It does not happen in any other English-speaking country that I have analysed, and indeed Declan and myself, and with Rory's help a few years ago, we went through numerous syllabi in English-speaking countries. I also speak French. I looked at some of the French ones. I have never come across one. The distinction, which I think I still argue, and I will argue to the bitter end, that there is a confusion somewhere in the echelons of the NCCA between a curriculum framework, where it is perfectly appropriate to use just learning outcomes, and an examination syllabus, which is a totally different animal. And in countries like Scotland, you have the curriculum framework, Education for Excellence, because I know we have some Scottish people here, is drawn up by Education Scotland. But the examination syllabus, what my generation would have called the higher, are drawn up. They're detailed syllabi drawn up by the Qualifications Authority Scotland or something. It's Qualifications Authority. But they're two separate bodies drawing up one and then the other. So for the NCCA to use learning outcomes, that's perfectly fine for a curriculum framework. So for example, in the United States, you can find a broad curriculum framework for the various science subjects for 16 to 18-year-olds at federal level and at state level. But it's a matter for the schools to interpret them and to examine them. That's the difference. So it's where a school, where you're talking school-based assessment, then all they get from national level very often is, of course, a learning outcomes framework. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just really to get rid of the myth that I'm out of touch. I'm not out of touch. I have been regarded as a curriculum expert. I was the first member of the Curriculum Examinations Board back in the 80s, but I also led 3 major school-based curriculum projects. I chaired the Commission on the Points System, as many of you have mentioned, but I also have, some people are saying that I'm very elitist now because this approach we're taking is for just those who go to university. On the contrary, the people who would benefit least and would do worst if we go in this direction of a learning outcomes framework, are those who are already disadvantaged. And sometimes I wonder, does somebody realise that? And because there has always been the perception that people of privilege like to maintain that privilege. I know that is not surely a deliberate decision, but far from the learning outcomes only framework being a positive for students in, let's say, DESH schools, it would be the very opposite. So I've also collaborated with the Harvard Graduate School of Education on curriculum projects, and up very recently I was a member of the European Universities Association Institutional Review Panel, and at the moment I am an expert on the expert panel for the EU for education projects. So I am in touch. And Declan is recognised as an international expert on using learning outcomes. It's precisely because both of us have worked and spoken on the use of learning outcomes in curriculum design that we really understand what the positives and negatives are. So it's not that we're unaware of them. In fact, both of us would have been regarded as campaigners for the use of learning outcomes in third level curriculum. Declan's Practical Guide to Writing and Using Learning Outcomes, which is internationally recognised, has been translated into 13 different languages. The English, it's online in the Cora portal in University College Cork. It's been downloaded 60,000 times. I've never seen any other book downloaded so often. It's been cited more than 550 times, and Declan has provided training on the use of learning outcomes in curriculum design in third level in 33 different countries. So we really know what we're talking about. And these are examples of Declan's writing and using learning outcomes book in different languages. And an article that we wrote together some years ago in a European journal. Now, learning outcomes are statements of essential learning, and that's why they're so useful. And moving from aims and objectives approach to a learning outcomes approach was and continues to be a very good way of looking at curriculum, because you're looking at it from the student's point of view, what you want the student to be able to do at the end of the lesson, the module, the year, the program, or whatever. But they are described broadly in minimum acceptable or threshold level. So as soon as you want to grade, to introduce levels of difficulty, if you like, higher Bloom's taxonomy of learning, then and you want to get students to focus on the higher order skills, you must provide more than just learning outcomes. That's the concern we have. While they're a very valuable tool for identifying what learners should know and be able to do at the end of the course or program, it's not appropriate to use learning outcomes alone to define an externally assessed examination syllabus. Again, I repeat, a curriculum framework is not an examination syllabus or specification. Externally assessed examination syllabi provide much more detail than just learning outcomes. And interestingly enough, the NCCA report last May on the use of learning outcomes, where they had advice from people like Professor Priestley, very good reports. But the research question he was asked to address was not the research question we're concerned about. The research question, we're not concerned about the use of learning outcomes in the abstract. We fully approve the use of learning outcomes in the abstract. But we're talking about using learning outcomes only as the way to design a curriculum, a syllabus or a specification in a high stakes externally assessed examination. That's not mentioned at all in the May 2019 report. And indeed, Dr. Priestley wasn't asked to address that question. So as we would often say to the students, make sure you ask the right research question before you start doing your thesis. The 5 case studies which were put forward in this report last May, it's on the website, it's a very good report, British Columbia, Ontario, Singapore, Hong Kong, New Zealand. Remember, in Canada, like the United States, there is no externally assessed examination. So while in fact some of the syllabus material is quite detailed and quite interesting, I'm not going to talk about them. I'm just going to look at Singapore, Hong Kong and New Zealand, which do have externally assessed examinations. But they're not assessed by the Curriculum Council, which produced the documents you talked about. They're assessed, as you will see, by none of them look at the material that is produced by the assessment board. That's the difference. It's the difference. It's as if our NCCA was to provide the curriculum framework and the State Examinations Commission would have provided a detailed specification. We just haven't done it that way. That's not the way it has ever been done in Ireland. So we assume that our NCCA provides both the curriculum framework and the examination specification. And I think that that's where they've gone wrong. Now, Declan and I, and indeed with the help of Rory some years ago, we went through, I think I counted 12 different countries or jurisdictions, examined their syllabus in detail, their material, all their curriculum and syllabus material in detail. And in all cases, we found that, for example, in Singapore, where there's a very good description in the Priestley report of May 2019 of the curriculum framework, he doesn't mention at all that the final examination is the Singapore-Cambridge GCE advanced level, which has a lot of similarities to the UK Cambridge GCE A level. So, as you can see, it has nothing to do with the curriculum commission, the National Curriculum Council, but it's set by the Singapore Education and Assessment Board, a separate board altogether, which both sets out the syllabus and examines it. And the detail again, I'm not going to have there's a lot of detail in those documents. Similarly, in the Hong Kong material, the chemistry alone, for example, has 174 pages. That's not mentioned at all, but because, of course, the document is talking about learning outcomes, it's not talking about examination, specification, or syllabi. But just to make the point, because we didn't look at Hong Kong in our own report 6 years ago, and New Zealand, which I didn't look at that time either. I mean, I had looked at it, but I didn't specify it because we took 6 other ones in our report. Again, there's a PDF file, a separate file to the curriculum file online. The National Certificate of Education Achievement is administered by the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, a bit like Scotland there. There's a PDF file online which provides 277 pages of detail relating to science syllabi in New Zealand. Declan has set out, and I know some of you have it, but for people who might be interested, he has the links, the online links to 10 or 12 different countries or different jurisdictions, both their syllabus and their specifications for science subjects for examination purposes. So I was delighted to see Peter Childs because I had never discussed this with Peter before, but I was so pleased in his November Science article just to read that I feel that the current reform, and particularly the revised Leaving Cert science specification, particularly in the lack of detail for teachers, will actually undermine the drive to promote STEM subjects and careers in the future. It may well result in fewer students taking Leaving Cert science courses, especially the physical sciences, and this impact on take-up of third-level STEM courses, and thus impact on take-up of third-level STEM courses. And I have to say personally, my own grandson, my number 3, has just sat the junior certificate. They were very disappointed in his school with the paper. And I just heard last night that at the Young Scientists, one of the chief judges also expressed horror in a way or concern at the vagueness of the junior science examinations paper last summer. But I'm not sure I'm going to be able to convince after transition year my grandson to take a science subject because he just doesn't see where it's going. And, you know, these are the kind of issues that are very real at a time when we're trying to persuade more and more students to take up STEM subjects. In Ireland, the Minister for Education ultimately decides the curriculum. The NCCA is an advisory body. The Minister is the ultimate decision maker. Some NCCA recommendations over the past 20 years have been overruled by Ministers for Education. And I don't apologise for saying I hope that the NCCA's proposed template for the specification of the leading cert science subjects will be rejected by the next minister. I had Joe McHugh's name in, I had to change that last night, because by the time, I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll see. And I just feel we have a fantastic group of teachers and students taking science in Ireland. We have to be proud of that. We have to celebrate their achievements between BT Young Scientist, SciFest, many European and international STEM awards won by our Irish students, high respect for our Irish science graduates and teachers. My eldest daughter, whom I'm meeting in India next week, because she heads up a science team in a pharma company in San Francisco, and she's off. She has a team in Bangalore in India. But she and many of those with her who graduated, many over the last 20, 30, 40 years, sadly we lost a lot of them to Ireland. She graduated in the 80s. There was no work in Ireland for scientists that decade. So she and most of her class, I think out of her class, there's only one who's now located in Ireland. But nevertheless, you know, we are sharing, if you like, the expertise of our excellent science teachers. And Ireland is proud of its science teachers and its students. So I'm just suggesting today that the ISTA should continue to put pressure on the NCCA and the Minister for Education to provide sufficient depth of treatment and other syllabus and examination documentation to help teachers to implement the new physics, chemistry and biology syllabi. And I've adapted from Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for evil to prevail is what he said, is for good people to do nothing. I'm saying the only thing necessary for the NCCA template to prevail is for good people to do nothing. We have to speak up. I don't think in my whole academic career, and I started working in the Department of Education in 1959, now that will date me, I don't think I have ever felt as strongly about something. This is serious for Ireland and for our very high standard of education, which we have had for over 100 years since independence. So to me, it's essential that members of the biology, chemistry and physics development groups speak up and use your status as advisors. You are advisors, but if you remember when there was a big row the other week about the celebrations, the centenary celebrations and the RIC, that whole issue, the first thing the minister said, well, I was advised by my advisory group. Now, Dermot Ferriter spoke up and said you were not advised by your advisory group. But it's very important that you can go back, even if you are a minority on a development group. I have very rarely had to use it, but I've been on 12 or 13 different committees, big committees over the last 30, 40 years. And if necessary, you write a minority report and say, I don't agree with this. You go along with it. You don't fight personally. These are not personal issues. I have nothing personally against anybody involved in curriculum design. But as a professional issue, I don't agree with this design. I was going to say, I hope I'm proved wrong that the new design is better, but nothing I have yet seen internationally. And I would ask the NCCA to come up with even one example of a country which uses this template for an externally assessed public high-stakes examination. So thank you very much.